Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy McCormick. I'm board president of Pratt Memorial Library in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion with author Phillip Goodrich and audiobook producer and director May Wuthrich on their audiobook original Somersett, Benjamin Franklin and the Masterminding of the American Independence. I want to thank the members of the Pratt Memorial Library Association, whose generous contributions make programs like these possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining. Details can be found on our website, prattmemoriallibrary.org. Thank you, as always, to Jess Reed of Greenwich Point Marketing, who helps Pratt Library with all of our virtual programming and does a great job of keeping Pratt Library connected to the community. The audiobook of tonight's presentation, Somersett, is available for checkout at prattlibrary.org or for purchase through Athena Books in Old Greenwich. This program will be recorded and we'll send a link with a follow-up email. Please write any questions you might have for May and Phillip in the chat, and we'll be sure they will answer them after tonight's discussion. Now it is my honor to introduce our guest. Phillip Goodrich is a practicing general surgeon and an American history enthusiast. He's developed a fascination with the lesser told tales of America's founding years. His interest has led him to extensive research into the personal and political lives of American greats, thus pointing him to this little known and little taught slice of American Revolution history. To learn more about him, please visit philgoodrichauthor.com. We'll put that in the chat. And now for May, Old Greenwich resident May. Over the years, May Wuthrich has taken on many roles in the entertainment industry. She's a former actor, book editor, literary agent, and film development executive. She's been producing and directing award-winning audiobooks for 15 years. With 400 titles to her credit, she has worked with a wide range of talent, including Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award-winning authors, multi-talented award-winning actors such as those that comprise this cast, celebrity narrators, and audiobook pros. To learn more about May, visit maywuthrich.com. And now, May and Phillip, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you,
Thank
Kathy.
you.
So before we get started, I just would like to orient you all to a few things. First of all, Nikole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times 1619 Project have given us a new way to understand and talk about slavery. As a result, the language around slavery has changed. So Phillip and I will endeavor to talk about enslaved people, not slaves, and enslavers, not slaveholders. We will probably fail in this regard, so forgive us if we do. In the audio clip we'll play for you, you'll hear one of the Quaker characters speak in what's known as plain English, which uses the second person pronouns thee and thou. This isn't an author-created affectation, but rather reflects the Quaker belief that all people, no matter the situation, relationship, or station in life, are equal in the eyes of God. You'll also hear the term manumission, a word I wasn't familiar with before I read this book. Merriam-Webster defines the verb manumit, to release from slavery, and the noun manumission, formal emancipation from freedom. Okay, now we can get started. Phillip, your book is about the series of events that led to the founding of America, one that was not explored in the musical Hamilton, not taught in grammar schools or high school. You take us behind the scenes to a little-known part of our history and the roles played by Benjamin Franklin, his inner circle of British abolitionists, allies in the North American colonies, the previously enslaved person, James Somerset, and then there was the leaking of the Hutchinson letters. Each of these helped further the realization of independence from the crown. So let's start at the beginning with Benjamin Franklin. What circumstances led to his obsession to separate the North American colonies from Britain?
Well, we need to keep in mind through this entire discussion, Benjamin Franklin was almost a generation older than any of the other founding fathers. As a result, he had already experienced the colonial situation during King George's War. Most of us don't remember what King George's War was, if we ever knew. It actually had taken place in the 1740s throughout Europe as well as in the American colonies. Franklin had a personal experience with recalling the destruction of both Schuylerville, New York, and North Adams, Massachusetts, where these settlements were burned to the ground by an army of French and indigenous persons, and multiple settlers were slaughtered. So Franklin was already nervous about the location of Pennsylvania and its exposure to attack. At the conclusion of that war, he was concerned that the Penn family, who were the owners of Pennsylvania, were not providing appropriate defense for their colony. And Thomas Penn, who was the son of William Penn and was at that time the principal owner of the colony, made it very clear to Franklin and to the Crown and to Parliament that he had no intention of providing a nickel for defense of Pennsylvania because it wasn't necessary. Franklin, of course, was distressed over that stance, and it became worse at the beginning of the French and Indian War when General Braddock, with a young George Washington, experienced one of the worst defeats in British history at the hands of the French and indigenous armies again. And Franklin swore that he was going to go to London to get this all straightened out. So at that time, Franklin was probably the only colonist that was known widely throughout Europe. Due to his electricity experiments, he was a known entity in every capital city in Europe. And at the same time, because of that, he was very desired as a speaker. So ultimately, Franklin is invited to come to London by members of the Royal Society. And two of the members that invite him are Peter Collinson, who is a botanist, but more importantly, Dr. John Fothergill, who is probably the busiest physician in London, who is himself a member of the Society of Friends, what we now know as the Quakers, and at the same time had personal knowledge of almost every political figure right up to George III. So Franklin considered this an incredibly valuable contact to come to London and lobby for separation of Pennsylvania from the dreaded Penn family.
Great, thank you. Now you mentioned Dr. Fothergill, and he was a member of Benjamin Franklin's, what we're calling the inner circle. Can you tell us who the other individuals were in this inner circle and how they came to work with Franklin? What motivated them to work with Franklin?
Great question. All of these members of the inner circle were personally acquainted with Franklin, obviously, by 1765. John Fothergill had invited him to come over. Franklin spent some time with John Fothergill, and Dr. Fothergill ends up becoming Benjamin Franklin's personal physician. So one of his tasks is to keep Benjamin healthy, and at the same time, they develop a mutual admiration that carries over for the ensuing 20 years. When Franklin explains his mission to get Pennsylvania separated from the Penn family, Dr. Fothergill steps in and says, well, I can introduce you to some of the most influential people in Parliament, as well as to people that have the ear of the crown. And I think if you just patiently explain your dilemma to them, they'll step in and they'll take care of this for you.
Oh.
As it turns out, they listen patiently to him and they tell him that's nonsense. We have no issue with Thomas Penn. Thomas Penn is a very loyal British subject. He contributes generously to Parliament and to the Crown, and he's very well appreciated throughout London. So we're not going to take his colony away from him. At the same time, Franklin had already met a young British politician named Thomas Pownall. Pownall had actually come to the American colonies as early as 1754, and ultimately, while he was there between 1754 and 1760, he becomes Lieutenant Governor of New Jersey. He becomes Governor of New York. He becomes Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and he becomes governor of South Carolina. So by the time he returns back to London in 1760, he probably knows the American colonies better than Benjamin Franklin does. just because of all of his contacts while he is serving in these multiple different occupations in the American colonies. So Pownall is a valuable contact, and at the same time, his brother John is first secretary of the Board of Trade, which is the governmental arm of the crown that actually rules over the colonies. So between Thomas and John Pownall, this is an extremely valuable contact for Franklin. Finally, John Fothergill's almost surrogate son, a man named David Barclay, is also a Quaker. David Barclay has been an arms dealer in the colonies for years. Now, that may sound violent to you, and it's like, what is a Quaker doing as an arms dealer? But his angle was that colonists need weapons for hunting. And he proceeds to be one of the big arms dealers for Pennsylvania to provide them weapons essentially for subsistence. At the same time, Barclay, during the course of this time, becomes one of the earliest successful bankers in London. And I think you would probably know his family today for their institution, which was actually founded by David Barclay. It's a bank that we all know as Barclays Bank. It was founded by Benjamin Franklin's good friend, David Barclay.
So that was the initial group. And then Franklin met Thomas Paine and brought him in. And tell us about that.
Yes, Franklin was desperate to find a writer that he could put in the American colonies throughout the American Revolution. He knew that he couldn't stay as a writer in the American colonies because he would be a target for capture and either ransom or execution to try to end the revolution. So he knew that he had to get out of the American colonies. At the same time, he needed essentially a version of himself, if you will, an acolyte that could continue to write political commentary. Well, the inner circle of that time, the three together, Franklin, Barclay, and Fothergill, could not come up with a name. And Franklin went in search of such an individual to the local public houses in London and came upon an exciseman that had recently been fired from the excise, was just one step away from debtor's prison, and had some experience in writing bawdy poems and lyrics. And Franklin said, "So you're a writer?" And he said, "Well, not in your line of work, but I can be a writer." And Franklin proceeds in the summer of 1774 to give this man a cram course in political science and political debate. That individual's name is Thomas Paine. At the end of the summer of 1774, Franklin arranges for his passage to the American colonies. Payne arrives in December of 1774 with a book in his portfolio that he is going to hang on to for an entire year. And it's only after Franklin comes back to the colonies for a brief period of time that he tells Payne to go ahead and publish this. We know this book today as Common Sense. It's to this day the single bestseller per capita in the history of American publishing. And that was published by this unknown writer who Benjamin Franklin discovers, makes him his protege, and keeps him in the American colonies throughout the Revolution.
Okay, this is a very good place to play our clip from the book. It's Franklin in conversation with Thomas Pownall and Dr. Fothergill. So let's hear it.
Okay, we're going to start the audio clip now.
In March of 1772, Franklin grew frustrated and angry. At age 66, he was already exhausted by the mundane tasks of his daily routines and feared his opportunities to achieve his goal of freedom for Pennsylvania were slipping away. The Crown was clearly not going to wrench his province from the hands of the hated Penn family, and Parliament was simply disinterested in the matter. Any consideration of manumission of American slaves appeared exhausted. The Crown enjoyed the fruits of slave labor to bolster its global economy and was not going to move to upset that delicate balance of relative immorality for relative wealth. And Parliament was not inclined to make any movement to end slavery in Great Britain and was not empowered to press toward manumission in the colonies. It truly appeared that Franklin's efforts had reached an impasse. He was staring up a blind alley, and there were no doors to enter. One night, at a dinner meeting of the Inner Circle in late March, his anger overflowed and he lashed out. Just one slave, and perhaps we could still build this.
Dr. Franklin, this simply cannot happen. We have tried everything. We have made a noble effort toward your goal, and we simply have exhausted our remedies. I have nothing further to suggest.
Pownall and Franklin sipped their ale. Clearly, they had already identified a potential motivation for the plantation owners in the southern British colonies to join the cause of Massachusetts in separation from the Crown. The letters were waiting in Benezet's school in Philadelphia. The ensuing silence was pervasive, and almost everyone present fell victim to their despair. But then a voice from the other side of the table.
Dr. Franklin, thou hast said one. Is that correct?
It was the naturally tremulous, timid, but eloquent voice of John Fothergill. Pray, go on, Doctor.
Well, there is a man here in London that may be able to deliver thee but one, manumitted.
What? How?
There is a man named Granville Sharp, a mirror of thine own Anthony Benezet in Philadelphia, but more legally inclined, an Anglican, working steadfastly, but so far unsuccessfully, at legal manumission through the courts.
Now Franklin sat upright, intrigued. Yes, I've heard of this Sharp, but have yet to meet him. All the same, I am aware of dear Benezet and his efforts for unfree persons and Native Americans in Philadelphia. He works to support them and to educate them, but certainly has neither the inclination, nor the resources, nor the background to pursue legal remedy in the colonial courts. It would be difficult to conceive of a like-minded individual here in London who would have a better chance of it. Fothergill gently contradicted him.
Oh, but it seems that Sharp is something of a self-taught solicitor, and an exceedingly bright and talented man. He has appropriated for himself an extensive knowledge of English common law, and now has the ear of a key jurist on the King's bench. They are said to be working together quietly to identify the case that will reveal to all Great Britain the immorality and failed social contract of human slavery.
Franklin slumped down again, demonstrably skeptical.
I've ended the audio.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you for playing that. So anyway, that's a perfect setup for the introduction to who James Somerset was. So can we hear about that, Philip?
Sure. James Somerset was actually born in Sierra Leone, Africa, and at about the age of 8 would have been brought to Barbados as an enslaved person. The majority of enslaved persons were not enslaved because of battles or wars or other such nonsense in Africa. They were enslaved out of debt peonage. Very likely his parents owed a debt to their local tribal chief, and one of the ways of discharging that debt was with children. So as a young man, he would have been brought to Barbados to spend a year there seasoning, developing yellow fever, surviving it, and then he could be sold once again into Virginia. It's important that we keep in mind that this man was then purchased by a British subject in Virginia As an adult, 20 years later, he was brought to London by this same individual that had purchased him, a man named Charles Stuart. They lived together with James Somerset serving as Charles Stuart's manservant for approximately 22 months. And then one day, James Somerset simply doesn't come home. Now, Charles Stuart raises an alarm within 24 hours saying this man has either, been a victim of foul play or he has fled, he's run away. And that alarm goes out to the bounty hunters on the streets of London. They essentially identify, find James Somerset and capture him, bring him back to Charles Stuart. Stuart is enraged by Somerset's behavior and orders the bounty hunters to simply load him on a slaving ship to go back to the British West Indies and to resell him, if you will, back into enslavery in the British West Indies. At that point, Granville Sharp, the abolitionist referred to in the previous audio clip, steps in and files a writ of habeas corpus, forcing the British on the wharves to free James Somerset to the custody of Granville Sharp. And at that point, Sharp files lawsuit in the British courts against Charles Stuart. This case has been known forever after that as Somerset versus Stuart. And that takes us into where James Somerset then has to stand as the plaintiff of all things against Charles Stuart.
So what exactly do they have in mind? What do they think is going to happen?
Well, the whole idea that Granville Sharp had from this case, and after a significant interview with James Somerset, is I think they're trying to do something that's illegal in the British legal system. Whether it's legal in the American colonies is immaterial because we're in London. And by everything Granville Sharp understood, they could not legally do this. And so the only remedy then was to set James Somerset free. And this is what Sharp had been pushing for 2 or 3 years previously, was I've got to find a case that is going to force the British Supreme Court to set an enslaved person free, essentially to achieve a legal manumission. It had never been done before, and Sharp was determined that he was not going to stop until he had achieved manumission of an enslaved person in London.
And that would set a precedent.
It absolutely would, because of the status of the court. This was at the Court of King's Bench, which would be the equivalent of the United States Supreme Court today. So if one slave was manumitted, as far as Granville Sharp was concerned, that should accomplish the manumission of all enslaved persons on the island of Great Britain.
Okay, and what happened?
Okay, so the case is filed at the Court of King's Bench in December of 1771. The first arraignment takes place in January of 1772, and a further trial date is set. At that point, Granville Sharp starts enlisting attorneys to prosecute his case against Charles Stuart. He enlists 2 sergeants of the courts, which is, sergeants are not a military rank. They are considered the top attorneys serving at the Supreme Court level in London. The planters step in on the side of Charles Stuart, and they recruit 2 attorneys general to defend Charles Stuart against this case. And so by April, this is becoming the case of the century in London. Far from being an obscure case, this is all over the press. And by May, we've got 2 brand new attorneys that have never testified before in front of the Court of King's Bench, both testifying for James Somerset at the behest of Granville Sharp. And ultimately, with their statements and with the acquiescence of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in London, that justice is Lord Mansfield, He agrees with James Somerset's attorneys that yes, this is not legal in the British court system. And on June 22nd, 1772, he declares that therefore this enslaved person must be set free.
Okay. So, we previously noted that this was a little known story. In the introduction to the 1619 project, Somerset v. Stewart is referred to, but no details offered. You consulted over 50 sources that resulted in 1,400 endnotes. You really had to do a lot of digging to put together all these details of what happened leading up to Somerset, and then how this inner circle continued to work to achieve the revolution. Your book is a work of nonfiction, but you employ dialogue that took place hundreds of years ago. Tell us about the sources you consulted and how you came up with this idea of including dialogue by the principal players.
Okay. First of all, credit to Yale University. I'm not picking on or patting backs on any particular Ivy League institution, but Yale University, as part of their holdings, through the efforts of the Packard Humanities Institute, holds essentially every primary reference they can find on the writings of Benjamin Franklin, letters to Benjamin Franklin, editorials that he wrote, editorials that mention him, receipts, documents, anything that from the time period that has Benjamin Franklin is in their archives. When we read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, he provides us a lot of dialogue. And so much of the dialogue that you will hear in the audiobook was actually provided to us 250 years ago by Dr. Franklin. Thank you, Dr. Franklin. At the same time, as so many other contemporary authors today are saying, we wanted to provide you dialogue to keep you awake. We have not sacrificed any of the history. I promise you, we have not sacrificed the history. Some people have criticized the initial effort, and that's why now I'm providing the entire exhaustive set of endnotes, and it runs to close to 1,600 endnotes documenting all these facts that took place leading up to the manumission of James Somerset.
So the question is, how has this stayed so hidden for hundreds of years? And there's a powerful scene in the book in which David Barclay, the Quaker, who was a staunch supporter of freeing enslaved people, he, for 10 years after America was founded, he continued to pay close attention to the American abolitionist efforts. And he became increasingly incensed that these promises that Franklin made to him and other members of the circle have not been kept. So in 1792, he brings his family together, and he states that his family will have no business dealings with slave owners ever. He goes on to say that he will support no effort to memorialize his work on behalf of America, and he forbids family members from writing a biography of those years. Then he confesses to having destroyed all his ledgers, correspondence, and notes prior to 1785. So this explains steps that, of course, Barclay himself took to hide his involvement. But what else happened? I mean, how could this stay hidden for so long?
Well, another good question. At that same time, Franklin realizes that as this is playing out, this is not a good story. This is, in many ways, a tragic and horrific story of the inception of the United States of America. And he and Fothergill and Pownall had already agreed that once they were successful in getting this accomplished, they were going to start destroying the evidence. Now, Father Gill tragically has not survived the American Revolution, but Pownall and Franklin proceed to start destroying all of their correspondence, all of their documents, all of their letters that address any of this effort. Interestingly enough, though, Thomas Paine refuses to do that. And interestingly enough, at the same time, Lord Mansfield still has his notes on the basis of the James Somerset case. And both of these have been very carefully preserved at that point. Unfortunately, in 1780, before the end of the American Revolution, riots break out in London against Roman Catholics. Lord Mansfield was probably the most prominent and public of Roman Catholics in London, and his house, including his personal library, is burned to the ground in the riots. We lose all of the Somerset commentary in that fire. Thomas Paine spends the remainder of his life accumulating all of his paperwork, and in direct contradiction to Franklin's request that he destroy this, he very carefully preserves every page of it. He preserves this, he brings this to the United States in 1806, gives it to the people that he was living with, Lord Bonneville and his family, to preserve this. Mrs. Bonneville keeps all this documentation through the 1820s, long after Thomas Paine is gone, with the intent that she and her son are going to catalog all this and get it published so that people know the story. They store this in a warehouse in, of all places, St. Louis, Missouri. And in a warehouse fire in 1843, the entire Paine library goes up in smoke. That ends the trail.
And yet you were able to piece this story together.
We were able to piece this story together, but it took a lot of legwork over a lot of time. We have been able to uncover biographies that have long since been forgotten by various authors about such individuals as Thomas Paine, Thomas Pownall, John Pownall, Lord Mansfield, and contemporary authors have also started providing some contribution to this as well. And this has just become a groundswell in the last 15 years, finally culminating in this story.
I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the Hutchinson papers. This was another very important event in getting the North and South on the same page about the revolution. What can you tell us about the Hutchinson papers?
Okay. Franklin had realized after chatting with members of the Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh, including David Hume, who's considered probably the top philosopher of the 18th century, as well as Adam Smith, who you might recognize as the author of Wealth of Nations. These were personal acquaintances of Franklin as well. They had told him that you are going to need to have a motivation if you really want to achieve a revolution. It first convinced him, along with Thomas Pownall, that there was no mechanism for just pulling Pennsylvania out of the British Empire. You've got to enlist all of your neighbors in the American mainland, essentially the 13 colonies from New Hampshire to Georgia, if you want to accomplish this. And now you're going to have to come up with a reason for all 13 of those colonies to participate in this. In the South, David Hume was probably the one that hit on the idea that, you know, Dr. Franklin, if you can convince the Southern colonial enslavers that the British Empire intends to abolish human slavery, that alone would put the fear of God in these men and would make them want to separate from the empire immediately, simply to preserve their finances, to preserve their wealth, to preserve their land, to preserve their families and their own being. So that's when they hit on the idea that if we can achieve manumission of a single enslaved person, you can send notice to the Southern enslavers and that will bring them into revolution, but that will have no impact in Massachusetts and New York. You're going to have to come up with a different cause there. Well, the cause that was already becoming a source of frustration, both in Boston and New York, was this process of quartering British soldiers. At the end of the French and Indian War, the British military had stayed in Boston and New York, and it was presumed that they had stayed there at the behest of the crown to provide defense of the colonies. It turned out after the fact that far from it, in Boston, they were there to act as a police force at the request of one of the British royal governors, Thomas Hutchinson. He had written secret letters to government officials in Great Britain saying, you guys have got to keep a military presence here to keep these radicals under control. They have these two crazy cousins named Adams that are causing trouble nonstop. And they've already burned down my lieutenant governor's house. They have ransacked my house. They've threatened to kill my family. You've got to keep soldiers here. So those letters were stored in secret in London. But guess who was a former governor of Massachusetts and had access to those letters? Benjamin Franklin's good friend, Thomas Pownall. So when the keeper of those letters unexpectedly passes away, his brother takes over the keeping of those letters and advertises that anybody who wants these letters can have them, because otherwise I'm just going to destroy them. So Thomas Pownall goes and picks up not only his old letters, but all the letters, including the Hutchinson letters, and then proceeds to give the Hutchinson letters very quietly to Dr. Franklin. And Dr. Franklin decides that once he's sure that they can actually achieve manumission of a single enslaved person in London, he can very quietly leak all these letters to the Boston press, letting them know that the only reason we had a Boston Massacre in 1770, and the only reason that they are still quartering and drilling British soldiers on the streets of Boston is to keep you people under control because you don't behave correctly. That was the basis for the release of the Hutchinson letters. That brings Boston and New York and their colonies right into the Revolution as well.
And David Hume said something else to Franklin that really made him understand what his role had to be in order to achieve this revolution.
Absolutely, because we've been taught for 250 years that this was all about taxation without representation. And David Hume addresses this very plainly to Franklin in 1770. He says, Dr. Franklin, people do not have revolutions over a bad tax bill. They break windows over bad tax bills, but they don't put the lives of their family and their own lives on the line over a lousy tax bill. You've got to have something much more existential than that. And that's where Franklin starts realizing that he is going to have to come up with an existential cause for all 13 colonies to enter. The two causes that he comes up with, of course, are abolition of human slavery for the southern colonies, and at the same time, the quartering and drilling of British soldiers, the presence of a British police presence, if you will, to draw in the northern colonies.
And Hume also said that he was going to have to lead this effort, that he had to be the single person who kept this going, because if there wasn't one person who was in charge, it would never happen.
Correct. He told Franklin, he said, if you look through history, the only revolutions that succeed is if somebody is there fueling the fire throughout the course of the revolution. So Dr. Franklin, I know you're an old man, but by God, this is your thing. You're going to have to make it through this. And that really, of course, devolved then on John Fothergill, his personal physician. And Dr. Fothergill was tasked with, okay, you've got to keep this man out of the pubs. You've got to keep him away from trouble, and you've got to keep him focused on politics. That's also why it was so important that they get Franklin to a safe haven, and that's why he relocates to Paris and spends the entire American Revolution within the safekeeping of Paris and Versailles and away from the British government.
Great, thank you. let's talk about the audio edition. We've discussed that one of the literary conventions you used was to break out of narrative to scenes of dialogue. And this is one of the ways that we expanded upon your original work. We took scenes that were formerly in narrative form in which people were speaking to each other, and we adapted them into scenes of dialogue. So, and we did that quite a bit throughout the book. And then there were a couple of other things that we did. We added courtroom scenes during the Somerset v. Stewart deliberations, which would give listeners the opportunity to hear both sides of the legal argument. When you originally conceived this part of the book, it was all narrative. And then when we started to pull out the actual testimony, it became a very different it brought it to life in a very different way. The other thing we did, we wanted to give Thomas Paine a larger role in the book. Of course, he was known for common sense, but other than that, he was not that well known. So you identified several additional excerpts, and we included two of them. One of them is a mock letter addressed to the Commander-in-Chief of British land forces in the colonies. And we chose this because of how relevant it is to the times that we've been living in. And when I think of this speech, I hear Ewan Morton, who played King George in Hamilton and also played Thomas Pownall and Thomas Paine. I hear his voice. So I am going to channel Ewan Morton, and I am going to read the beginning of this letter to just give you a sense of how history repeats itself. We all know history repeats itself, but this is the very, very articulate and impassioned Paine to Sir William Howe. To argue with a man who has renounced the use and authority of reason, and whose philosophy consists in holding humanity in contempt, is like administering medicine to the dead or endeavoring to convert an atheist by scripture. Enjoy, sir, your insensibility of feeling and reflecting. It is the prerogative of animals, and no man will envy you these honors in which a savage only can be your rival and a bear your master. So anyway, just that when I read that piece of writing, I just said we have to include it in the book. It was just too important not to.
Now that's from Thomas Paine's Second Crisis. People aren't aware that Thomas Paine served in George Washington's military from 1775 to 1779. He was there for 4 years doing the Ernie Pyle thing as the embedded pressman within the military. And he was writing all these pieces of literature throughout that time frame, further really encouraging Washington's army as well as the colonists throughout the 13 colonies. Stay with us, stay with us. We're going to prevail over this. We are going to be independent and we are going to be free.
And he also fought with George Washington.
He carried a rifle through the entire endeavor. He sure did.
So tell us about the new edition of your book.
Okay. The original edition, as May has so eloquently pointed out, did not contain all this dialogue. We wanted an effort that was consistent with the audiobook. I didn't know any of this. I have a very astute and esteemed producer-director that provides all this information for me, named May Wuthrich. And she said, your book needs to be consistent with the audiobook because people are going to purchase your print edition and they're going to think, maybe I've got the wrong book. So we wanted to make it consistent with the audiobook. And at the same time, I've been really driven to do more research into this, and we provide even more background, we actually can finally make the direct connection between Benjamin Franklin and the case of Somerset versus Stuart that does not appear in the original book, but it's a bonus for those of you that get the new print edition coming soon.
Yes, we're hoping to see it at the end of this month, right?
That is correct. We're still anticipating a launch by the end of this month. It's been in production now for the last 4 months, and we're finally getting some design work cleaned up, and we still anticipate a launch wherever you get your books. Same as with your audiobooks, and you can always go to my website.
Yeah, and if you'd like to hear any additional clips from the audiobook, you'll find them on Philip's website, which is philgoodrichauthor.com, along with a lot of other information I know you're going to find very interesting. So I guess we can now open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that.
Oh, are we looking at the chat?
Yes. Shanoy.
Kathy, are you going to monitor this, or because I'm not seeing the chat actually?
Okay. Yes, I'm not seeing any questions, but I see lots of nice comments. Absolutely brilliant. I'm enjoying every minute of the show. There's no end to learn. Thanks a lot to the organizers. I have a question, Philip. Once you're done with the final print edition and the rest of your research, or do you have a next topic that you're thinking about?
Well, we've reached the point now where we have 3, and I'm kind of trying to sort out how I'm going to do this. One of those is a subject, not really American history per se, but near and dear to my own heart. And that is a story from my own high school about a team, a basketball team in 1957 under forced integration that was brought together by a new coach, a newly minted coach, and they won the state basketball championship in 1957 with an integrated basketball team. It was almost unheard of in that era. And the reason that that's coming to the forefront is there are still several members of that team surviving. But as you can well imagine, a high school basketball team in 1957, these are not young men. So there's a little urgency there. More importantly, we are looking at stories of women in the American Revolutionary period. We know, or I certainly know, and many of you probably are aware as well, that whenever John Adams had to attend any event that his wife was also invited to, it automatically meant that John Adams was not going to be the smartest person in the room. As bright a guy as John Adams was, he was not close to Abigail Adams in terms of insight and brilliance. The woman was just flat out brilliant, but at the same time, as a product of her age, she was really barred from pursuing education. But nonetheless, there are stories there of many of the women behind the scenes during the American Revolution and their contribution. So we're exploring that as well. And last but not least, just as a teaser, we've got the Reformation and the Renaissance completely wrong. There's a lot of work to be done to clean that up, because it literally, the Reformation has less to do with Martin Luther and more to do with the rise of banking in Europe.
Thank you. I do see a question here. You made a point that real purpose of getting independence was not to fight against tax. Am I right? It was crystal clear about Southern states. I want to get clarification regarding the Northern states.
Sure. And, yes, while certainly from James Otis through Samuel Adams to John Adams, the question kept arising of taxation without representation is tyranny. And I would not argue that. But at the same time, the thing that became life-threatening was, as you're probably aware, on March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre was not about a bad tax bill. It was about the quartering of British soldiers. There were 8 sentries in front of the old State House in Boston, and essentially a group of colonists in Boston started harassing them and throwing snowballs at them and throwing probably rocks. I mean, ice balls, snowballs, rocks, whatever you want to call them. And finally, somebody in that crowd yelled fire, and the 8 British soldiers opened fire on the colonists, and 5 colonists were tragically killed, including probably the best known of those being Crispus Attucks. So at that point, it became clear to the Adams cousins that, whoa, this is getting serious now. This is life and death now. And the life and death was not about lousy tax bills, as David Hume once told Dr. Franklin. It was about having a military presence serving as police officers quite illegally as far as the Adams cousins were concerned. That you can't do this. You can't do this to British citizens. And of course, in the Hutchinson letters, they were laughing. They said, these aren't British citizens. These are colonists. They're not British anything. They're second-class people, and they don't deserve to be able to dictate anything to the British crown. So at that point, it becomes antagonistic to the point of existential. And that's what brings the northern colonies into the American Revolution, was the Hutchinson letters.
Thank you. And then Alice wants to know, what is the reason for referring to slaves as enslaved?
Well, the term slave is depersonalizing. At that point, you're trying to make them into a commodity. And yes, in the 18th century, they were commodities. Tragically, on March 7th, 1857, the single blackest moment in American history was the announcement by the American Supreme Court of the Dred Scott case, where it asserted that enslaved persons and essentially even free persons of sub-Saharan African extraction, Black Americans, were not really human beings. And if you doubt that that's what it said, read it again, because that's exactly what our United States Supreme Court, this wasn't the Supreme Court of Virginia, this wasn't the Supreme Court of Maryland, this was the United States Supreme Court, said into American law that Black people are not human beings. So we need to take away the focus of referring to people as slaves. These are people who were enslaved. It's not a commodity. It's human beings that were subjected to this kind of immorality and tyranny. So we refer to them as enslaved persons rather than slaves. Good question. I'm learning.
Does anyone else have any more questions for Philip or May? Philip, when you mentioned Yale University, did you actually go to Yale University Library? How did that work?
I did not, but the Packard Institute, the Packard Humanities Institute, has made all this available remarkably easily online. I owe it, and I pay a debt of gratitude in my acknowledgments to all of the online abilities today. This research could not have been done 20 years ago as relatively easily. It's exhaustive, don't get me wrong. There's a huge time commitment here, but it wasn't time wasted in travel. It's time diligently going through archives that are available online. So we hope that over the course of just the next several years, much more of the true American history is going to come out, because it's much more accessible than it ever was before. So good question. And all the respect in the world for Yale University. And I've been there, not as a student, but I've been there to visit. But they have provided me access without going all the way to Connecticut.
Because this is such a fascinating story, has anyone approached you about making this into a TV or a movie, film? Not yet. You're not allowed to
Not
say.
that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
I'm working through buffers and filters at this point from other individuals. I would assume that if they had heard such a thing, they would bring it to my attention. One of the things we have to keep in mind that I'm learning only now is that as important a story as this is, as far as I'm concerned personally, it is told through a white lens. And we are learning that in contemporary literature now, it is very, very important that we allow an audience with Black, Indigenous, and people of color to tell their story through their lens. And that's what we're seeing more and more. And thank God we are, because we need to be hearing these stories through the lens of Black persons, Indigenous persons, and people of color. And so that's what you're seeing more and more. And so I yield the stage and the microphone and the audience to them, because we all need to hear their story.
One more question. Mark says, most audiobooks are done with just one or two narrators. You chose to do a multicast recording. What drove you to that creative decision?
That's a May question, so I'm going to let her have it.
Well, when I first read the book, I thought we would just use one narrator. And I knew immediately who I wanted to do it. And that was the actor who played Benjamin Franklin and was the main narrator of the book, Robert Petkoff. He's a Shakespearean actor. He studied in London. He's worked in the theater, on Broadway, and he just is able to, as you heard, just take very complex ideas and language and really make it accessible. So I knew I had to cast him as the main narrator. But as Philip and I explored this together, Philip was extremely gracious and open to, creating something that was more dramatic and was, I thought, would make it more accessible, and basically to use, something that he employed in his book and just expand upon it. And so that's why we sort of worked on adapting it with the dialogue and adding these other elements that I've already discussed. And it was the right decision to make, clearly. So
I'm going to interject one quote that I hear to this day, echoing from May. She finally stepped up and she said, "Your listeners do not want to hear about James Somerset. They want to hear James Somerset." And that really was the inspiration for all of the dialogue. It allows us to actually hear, for the first time in history, James Somerset talking about his life and his situation. So,
that's right. That was a scene that we created for the audiobook, was the interview between Granville Sharp and James Somerset to determine whether he was a likely candidate and that he might actually be successful in winning his freedom. Yeah, that was an important moment. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions for May and Philip before we say goodnight? Do May or Philip, do you have any more closing remarks for anyone? Any suggested reading? Any other field trips we should go on? Should we go yeah, we're in New England. Is there anywhere we should go visit?
There's so much. Definitely give yourself the opportunity to go to both Boston and Philadelphia. Philadelphia, it's amazing. You need to know a name for me, and his name is Anthony Benezet. And the Anthony Benezet home is still carries a historical plaque on it, but you must know Anthony Benezet. If you learn no new character from my book, that's one you need to know.
And
And
why
is
is
that in
that?
Philadelphia?
And he was a neighbor of Benjamin Franklin's in Philadelphia. And he was really the first person of significance to say, you know what? He said, Black children and indigenous children and white children all have the exact same ability, the exact same intellect, the exact same moral fiber, the exact same ability to make better persons of themselves. And he asserted that in 1750. And so you really need to know Anthony Benezet's name.
Okay, well, we have a field trip to go on now. A follow-up field trip. Thank you both so much for joining us, and we look forward to your next project.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks for joining. Good night. Bye-bye.